Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Three Voices podcast. We have a special guest today, and we call it the podcast with Gunther Weil, a conversation with Gunther Weil. And I want to take a minute and introduce Gunther. Um, Gunther and I met over 20 years ago now in Boulder, Colorado. At the time, he was about to start a workshop on Tai Chi as a portal to presence. And it was Gunther's work at the intersection of working with Eckhart Tolle and his long-standing involvement with Tai Chi and other martial arts. And he created a wonderful workshop that brought us that we played at the intersection of those things. And that was the start of a great friendship that's still going strong to this day. And I'm very grateful for that. And over time, I got to know the depth and breadth of who Gunther was. And he's quite an amazing fellow, intellectually, spiritually, and in the life he lived. Um, and uh, we'll explore some of that today in the conversation. But just some highlights. He was born in Germany, just at the point where to a Jewish family, at the point where the Nazis had come to power. And so there was a whole experience of his family, getting out pretty almost or just in the nick of time. There's a whole story behind that. And they eventually immigrated to the US, to Milwaukee, where Gunther was raised in a upper middle class academic and musical Jewish family. His dad was a noted musician and noted psychologist. Um, Gunther, in his young years, was heavily influenced by the beatniks, jazz, and world music. He spent time in black jazz clubs. He was an amateur jazz drummer. He had early exposure to cannabis before we were even born, um, uh, and which set a foundation for his interest in altered states of consciousness, which is a major theme in his life. Um, he was, and I'd say still is, um, the last standing pioneer in the early experiments with psychedelics at Harvard University with Ram Dass or Richard Alpert back then, and Timothy Leary and a few others. They called it the Harvard Psilocybin Project. And he was a graduate student of Timothy Leary's in the course of getting his PhD in social psychology at Harvard. So he's got many stories about that. We'll talk a little bit about that. Um, he began an academic career and was influenced by some of the leading thinkers and knew many of them in psychology, like Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers and Arnie Nass, Gordon Alpert. Um, he founded I would say, spiritual wisdom and somatic practices were and still are a major theme. He's a 40-year practitioner of Tai Chi and an internationally recognized master instructor of qigong. And his he's had a focus on non-conceptual awareness and mindfulness. Led some Eckhart Tolle workshops in that vein, and his studies were quite broad. And he formally studied the Gurdjieff work with one of Gurdjieff's leading teachers named Willem Nyland. And in recent years, Gunther started a company called Value Mentors, which is did some pioneering work in the importance of values and in the use of a pretty sophisticated values instrument to reveal to an individual and to an organization, what their values are, and how they could be best leveraged in leading a growing, productive, and meaningful life. Um, and I'd say now he's in a phase of life where he's exploring saging or aging to saging, and looking at ways he could articulate his legacy, explore the prospect of death, and still continue to do what he always did, which is mentor others and inspire others by his example, his intelligence, and his work. So with that said, I welcome you, Gunther, and want to turn it over to you. And like we always do with our guests and with ourselves, we're exploring various dimensions of what does it mean to live an enlightened life. And we say, well, we know we're not enlightened souls, but we strive to do so, and we want to explore with each other, with our guests, and with our audience what that means. So I think we want to start there and say, what does that mean to you, and what do you think of when you hear that topic?
Well, well, let me begin by saying thank you for inviting me. Uh, I'm reflecting on our friendship, Rob, and it's been meaningful and fun. And we've explored a number of different streams over the years. So let me begin with an anecdote in response to your question: what does it mean to live an enlightened life? So many years ago, when I was living in Cambridge, Mass. I attended a lecture by Trungpa Rinpoche, who was one of the first Tibetan teachers here in the US and was responsible for, I think, probably the main Lama or Rinpoche responsible for creating an awareness of Tibetan Buddhism early. And I attended a number of his classes when he would be in Boston and also in a retreat in Vermont. But this was in a talk he was giving in Cambridge, and there was a Q&A after the talk, and someone asked him, Rinpoche, this was a really interesting question, came out of the blue, are you enlightened? And he paused for a long time, kind of half smile, and the pause was like painfully long. And then he said, and then he pointed up to the ceiling. He said, well, I'm under the lights. Yeah. So I thought that somehow or other that came up as an association when you asked me that question.
Right.
So one of the distinctions that I make in my own work, in my own life, really is distinguish between an experience of satori, or what's called an enlightenment experience, or a waking up experience, and the embodiment of that in daily life. And there's a real distinction between the two. You know, I'm not interested in experiences anymore. I mean, I've had my fill of that, whatever they are, including psychedelic experiences, which is not to say that I'm resistant or opposed to exploring psychedelics. I've done so a little bit in recent years and part of the so-called Renaissance. I did it in the context of exploring my own mortality and how I was am preparing for my own passing. Uh, but seeking experience to me is really a dead end, because there's a beginning, a middle, and end to any experience, and then you're back where you started. But the embodiment of awakening in daily life, in ordinary daily life, is a different thing. That's not an experience. That's a kind of living condition or a living state, if you will. So that's one distinction I would make. And then the logical question comes up when you make that distinction. Well, what are the characteristics of an enlightened life? Right. So, how do we know? What's the evidence based on? So how do I know that I'm living an enlightened life or not? Or how does anyone who asks that question, and your whole podcast is devoted to that theme, right? So what's the evidence?
Well, that's
What's
probably a very great question, and that's the intent here. And so, what one may say to that, Gunther, is, are you happy? Do you live the right path? Are you working and living, if I may, my theme is harmlessness. If we live our
Mhm,
life with harmlessness and joy, well, that's the first steps to living an enlightened life. Are we smarter? Are we richer? Are we thinner? Are we better looking? None of those really count. What
mhm,
really counts is how we see the world and how you, I mean, one sees the world. So I
mhm,
would say the path, or at least my path down the mountain, is the little green circle. I like to take my time and go around and not
mhm,
rush down the mountain and challenge the moguls. I want to walk through the trees and feel them being part of a universal web. I want to see
mhm.
people as I walk down the street and feel them, not just see them. So
Yeah.
that's one of the things, without getting me too deep into it, is I believe that an enlightened life is living it with joy, love, and harmlessness.
Mhm. Well, those are all significant criteria, and I would agree with some, perhaps not all of them. Speaking for myself, I make a distinction between a sense of inner equilibrium, or sometimes we could call it inner peace, and the
Mhm.
pursuit of happiness. Like our Constitution, has in it the phrase about the pursuit of happiness, right? So I think that can be a blind alley, because we how do we define happiness, for example? Like for many people, for most people, uh, happiness is a temporary state that arises with the satisfaction of a need or a desire. So when I
You say
buy
it's the
something,
satisfaction of a desire.
yeah, it creates for many people, they would define that as a state of happiness, right? So I'm happy that I got that new car. When I'm sitting in that new car, I'm smelling new car smell, and I'm driving down the highway, and I'm enjoying the mechanisms and so on. There's a state of happiness that many people would call that, a happy state, right? But it's temporary.
It's very temporary.
Yeah, because it's based on the satisfaction of a desire or a need, which is very quickly replaced by another desire or a need. And so there's a basic confusion that exists, I think, in general for most folks between happiness and what I'm describing as a sense of inner equilibrium or peace, which is where desires may arise, and but there isn't an attachment to them. So whether they're satisfied or not is not that important, okay, in terms of a. And I'm not talking about a need now, like for food or shelter or when we're children or infants and children, for loving parents. Those are real needs. Those are real human needs. But the sense of desiring something, desiring to be loved, desiring to be liked, desiring to have more possessions, desire for status. You mentioned a few: being thin, being even the desire to be healthy. Actually, interestingly enough, is sort of like a might be questionable in some sense. So I'm making again, what I'm doing here in my response, I believe I'm trying to do is to make a distinction between uh, the pursuit of happiness and the inner wish for truth or peace.
Well, that's a critical point, but I would say that the pursuit of satisfaction of desire is exactly the opposite of enlightened living. Because true enlightened living, and I say true, that's not a fair statement, a path, not the path, is freedom from desire, freedom from feelings or dictated responses. Okay, that happy, that new car, wanting that new car, that's not what we want to be. What we want to be is to be aware of life around us. To You use the word detachment or lack of attachment. That's
Mhm.
probably the critical variable in many people's thoughts, to be able to detach from desire, to live that life every day. Yes, you have to buy a car. Yes, it's nice to like your car. Okay.
Mhm.
But the fact of the matter is, if you're living that life because you want people to like that car with you and you want to be proud of that car, maybe you're too not you, I mean, maybe a person is too self-focused.
Yes. Well, again, I would be, let me offer you a more nuanced distinction here between the arising of desires,
Mm.
which is inherently a function of the human mind. That's what the mind does, basically. So the arising of desires, the observation of that, the preferences that may arise in the context of that in terms of satisfying the desire or not, that's sort of on one side of the equation. The other is the attachment to the desire or the identification with the need for that in order to feel like I'm whole. Okay. So
So I,
when the desire is arising in the context of filling a hole in myself, that's very different than, hey, I enjoy, pasta with, pesto sauce, right? So it's a, it's a different category, a different orientation, if you will. All right. So I, the challenge with a statement about you didn't say it this way. I forgot exactly what you said, but about ignoring desires or
being free from desires
free from
influence.
desires. Yeah, that can be that's the classical uh, process of, for example, of a monastic or yogic tradition in which one goes to the monastery to be free of the desire of sexuality, to be free of the desire of financial gain. One creates a special set of circumstances and a community in which those particular values attached to those are suppressed, if you will, or ignored or eliminated in some fashion by virtue of the context of living in a monastic environment. So, uh, as ordinary human beings, we have desires, right, that just come up. So, and again, it's a question I'm just reflecting on this. A question of when a desire comes up is okay. Maybe I'll choose that in this moment. Okay, so it or not, but I have the freedom to make that choice versus the identification, the need, the compulsion to fulfill that.
That's the key there too. You use something in many of the other sessions I heard you referred to the laboratory of daily life. And in that laboratory, yes, there are going to be those desires, okay?
Yeah, yeah.
And the actual, I'm not saying one should be free and not have desires, because I
Mhm.
am quite guilty of all those desires you referred to, okay? But it's the idea of, and you just said it, you're free to make the choice. You
Yeah,
don't have to have that car. You don't have to make that much money. You don't have to be loved by everybody. Okay. You
yeah.
when you can live in that laboratory, and I'd love to hear, you expanded into, I thought that was such a fascinating um, explanation you had, because I think that's what really enlightened living is, Gunther. Living, in the laboratory of daily life. That's where our
Mhm.
experiments occur. That's where
Yeah.
we learn how to live.
Yes. Well, I introduced the idea of a set of special circumstances of the monk, for example,
Yeah.
and the monastic life. So that tradition is associated usually with the heart And so what one does in that context is one devotes oneself to God, basically, in a nunnery or a lamasery or Benedictine monastery, what have you. So the attachment that is normally then uh, occurring in ordinary life to people, to money, to sex, to power, to rock and roll, whatever it might be, is basically obviated or eliminated or suppressed by the context of the monastic environment. That's not ordinary life, right?
Right.
The same could be said of the yogi, the traditional yogi, right? So if you've ever been in India and you see the yogi beggars, or sometimes in monasteries again, where there's very intensive yogic practice. That again is a function of creating special circumstances in which the desire, for example, again for sex or money or all the things we described, is curtailed or eliminated or suppressed by virtue of creating a set of circumstances in which the devotion then is to the mind, right? To what's traditionally called in the 13 yogas of Patanjali, the jhana yoga, right? Or, and associated yogas. So that again requires a set of special circumstances that relates to the mind, right? Compared to what I was describing, the heart in the monastic tradition. And the third category is the body. And this is less known, but you'll recognize it because also in India, for example, and a few other places, there is a tradition of what's called the fakir, Fakir, which are people basically, it's the bed of nails model, right? So people who actually are adopted or grew up or taken or given to these fakirs by families, and they learn how, through the suppression of bodily desires, including dealing with pain, doing it with extreme discomfort, dealing with things like going blind by looking at the sun intentionally, all of that, the creating a set of special circumstances through overcoming bodily needs and bodily desires uh, creates a capacity for a form of enlightenment that is predicated on the control and elimination of the bodily functions. Okay, so those are all the traditional paths that for the most of us, who started to study these traditions, those are the traditional paths. For example, now I was introduced in my 20s to the Gurdjieff work, which had a different orientation. It was called the fourth way. So what it did and does is it takes elements of the monastic, the fakir, and the yogic tradition, but it combines them in a mix in the laboratory of daily life, in which practices relating to the emotional center, the intellectual center, and the physical bodily center are introduced to create a harmony between those three centers, which creates a unity or a triunity or trinity in which create has the capacity to create a ongoing embodied sense of presence awareness through the introduction and the balancing and the harmonizing of those three centers. So that has been my primary spiritual path since my mid-20s, when I was first introduced to spiritual work, basically.
So how does it play out today though? Like to me, um, you talked earlier about seeking like a spiritual experience and then the embodiment of that.
Mhm.
To me, I find a meditation practice or even immersion in nature, which is a meditative practice, really, to be important in to do. It helps me then take that whatever that sense of unity, that sense of peacefulness, and bring it into the laboratory of daily living. What's your I'm not asking for, in this case, for a framework explanation, but what is your experience of that? Are you still meditating? I know you're doing Tai Chi. You spoke
Mhm.
to me, the other day about how you were going deeper into the spiritual dimension of it. Talk about that. Like, what is that? What is that the inside of Gunther looking like around that balance?
Yeah, I don't feel the need to meditate anymore.
Uh,
That doesn't mean I don't meditate, but I don't feel the need to meditate. Uh, because relating back to what I was saying a few minutes ago, the meditation cushion can become for us in ordinary life also a special condition. So the classical issue, for example, and I'll come back to my own experience in a moment, but the classical issue is that people sit on the meditation cushion for a half hour, 20 minutes or longer, and then they get up and they have dealing with ordinary life, and often it doesn't translate, or it may translate for a little bit, okay, but doesn't seem to carry over with any consistency or depth. Again, that's because one is using the meditation cushion in a quiet room and an incense and mantras or whatever the tool is. I consider those all, including walks in nature, for example, or being in nature. Those are heuristics. Okay, so for me, I enjoy being in nature. I love where I'm living now. For example, in Hawaii and Oahu on the southeastern coast, we have a 2.5 mile long world class beach here. My wife and I love walking that beach. I mean, being in the ocean, uh, just we do that a few times a week, a couple times a week. It's wonderful. We're like a 10-minute drive to world class ocean. So yeah, and when I'm walking on that beach, and with the smells and the sounds and the vibrations and watching happy people actually, 'cause- and the children playing and the dogs enjoying themselves, and yeah, it's a context, a special context in which joy and happiness and the connection, the feeling of oneness with the ocean and the what's called here in Hawaii the mana, which is the spirit of the land. Yeah, I love that. But again, I'm not dependent on that. Right? So my experience of living an enlightened life is whether or not there is moment to moment presence awareness. And that is not a set of special, dependent on a set of special conditions. It uses any condition that arises as a tool, as a metric, as a test in some cases of the capacity for ongoing, or at least more or less, more than less presence awareness, moment to moment. So embodied presence awareness is for me the sign, the symbol. And I would say at this stage of my life, I would say I'm probably in any kind of day, I'm probably operating around 40 to 50% with that quality.
and then
Interesting.
what happens when you're not?
I'm
What do
just
you,
busy. I'm busy with work. Like right now, for example, I'm engaged in a conversation. As I mentioned that, I have a moment of presence awareness because I use that as an alarm clock to come back to myself. But I don't try to introduce that into complex mental tasks, or if I'm in an emotional situation with somebody, I don't. I may try here and there to do that, but I want to be careful that I'm not using it as an emotional bypass. Okay. So sometimes I find it better just to feel the emotion and enter the emotion, feel the emotion, and let it pass. Or,
yeah,
as I was mentioning to you yesterday when we were speaking, if I can catch the thought form as it's arriving, as a negative thought form, or as a stress-inducing, potentially stress-inducing thought form, if I can catch it early enough, if there's enough awareness, then I possibly all I have to do there is shift my attention. So how I use my attention, the metric on how I'm using my attention is is an indicator, as a metric, an indicator of how much presence awareness is there. What am I attending to?
I would ask you, I
So
mean, that's magnificent. The is there, Gunther, do you feel that you've developed through the practices of your life the ability to direct or focus your attention? Is that something that, that you would suggest to others as to help being in the present, to being in the moment of the time?
yeah, it's definitely the right use of attention, I would call it, is a very important variable. It's a necessary but not sufficient condition. So, for example, in the traditional meditation tradition in Buddhism uh, and in other traditions, there is a focus on developing a focus on developing focus, a emphasis on developing the ability to concentrate. So, for example, the use of a mantra, or looking at a candle, or holding a particular thought. Uh, so that is it trains the mind away from its monkey mind tendency into a capacity to hold something in the attentional field. However, that same capacity is true of a Navy SEAL,
Yeah,
or a fighter pilot, or a neurosurgeon, or anyone who is got good kung fu in whatever they're doing. And by kung fu, I mean not the martial art per se. It includes that, but it includes like the kung fu of cooking, of writing, of you know, of
of
whatever
art,
one. Pardon me?
of art.
Of
Our,
art.
our cohort over here is
Yes, of
taking
art.
on the kung fu of art.
Yeah, so the word kung fu actually means
Yeah,
a mastery, right?
yeah,
In popular imagination it's associated with fighting, but that's only one of its applications. So the Chinese had their own phrase for identifying that particular ability as a complimentary phrase for someone who is accomplished, who has that, right? He has good kung fu. So, for example, in the Tai Chi world, when one reaches a certain level of mastery with Tai Chi, often people say he's got good kung fu, you
mhm.
know, and
Right.
because
Excellent.
that means that the level of Tai Chi has gone to the level of kung fu of mastery,
Of
basically. Right?
mastery, yes.
Yeah. So coming back, so I would say it's a necessary but not sufficient condition, because what's needed next is the capacity to dissolve and relax and enter into the so-called state of awareness, okay? Which
Okay.
is actually our birthright, which is always there, just underneath the surface, but it's layered over with the complexity of the monkey mind, or the emotional reaction, or the belief system, or the ideology, or whatever, or the need for
Or the
design, the
ego.
design, the
Yeah,
ego. Well, all
yeah,
of those are basically
yeah,
ego markers. They're basically how do I know I have an ego other than the so-called practical ego of turning my head when my name's called, or knowing how to put the fork in my mouth, which is also ego, but it's a practical, functional ego. It allows me to function. And, but the ego that relates to the need to be this or that, all the stuff we talked about,
yeah.
is a very different type of ego structure, and that is the one that is fed and reinforces the egoic need structure that we talked about at the beginning of our session today. So, coming back, I make a distinction between the practice of concentration, which in the Buddhist tradition is called a shamatha practice, or it's a beginning practice of developing focus, controlling the monkey mind, and then vipassana, which is the so-called insight phase, which involves a different set of tools, if you will. And then beyond that, the Mahamudra, the Dzogchen practices, which are at a completely different level also, which incorporate and are in part dependent at the beginning on depending on the individual, so the capacity to develop focus and the capacity to develop relaxation and contemplation, but then go beyond that.
Do you have a need to explore those different techniques or have you come to a place where you've kind of integrated them into your daily living? You know what I
Both
mean?
and, both and,
Yeah.
both and. I would say the primary technique is, and this is actually comes out of the Tibetan tradition, but it's analogous, if not identical, to the Gurdjieff method of self-remembering, which is the moment, what's called in Tibetan tradition, in the Dzogchen, and sometimes in the Mahamudra tradition, called short moments, repeated short moments. What are
Hmm.
those short moments? The moments where I enter into or am entered by, and that distinction is also sort of an artificial one, of presence. So there is an awareness of presence awareness.
Mhm.
Because
Right.
You
I
know,
noticed that I just want to segue slightly and bring Thomas in. I noticed Thomas, as soon as Gunther started talking about moment to moment awareness, that you smiled.
mhm.
And you're smiling now as he's speaking about the moment, the short moments. Is there a question you have, Thomas, to you want to ask Gunther about this?
Now, the first, Gunther, I just have to say that it's a pleasure listening to you because um, how you have processed the Gurdjieff system and your overall experience is it's a like understanding, and it's just so refreshing to hear someone else speaking about this. I have in my work, I finally got to a point where I started asking people, where does life take place? I mean, for my own work, it's where does life take place? The only place that we're actually alive, or the only time we're actually alive, is right now.
yeah,
So then the next step is, why aren't we more here? Well, if we look at ourselves, if we observe ourselves, what we see is that the attention, the focus of attention, as you were describing earlier, tends toward mostly wants and desires. And so it's in our head. It's not empirical, it's not outside, or a combination of the two. So what happens first when I ask myself, like, where does life take place? And I know it only takes place now. And if I want to be alive, like I have one of my aphorisms, the road ahead is clear for me because it is clear to me that absent being consciously self-aware in the present, there is no road. So for me, it's constant, like you were saying earlier. It's a moment. It's a refreshment every moment, and we need something to wake us up. I have, like you were describing earlier, I have alarm clocks all over so many things because
yeah,
daily living, like Gurdjieff said, you have to abandon the system, and that's not just the system he was teaching. Any system, you have to
yeah,
get to a point where you are, in your descriptions, we everything falls away except for being here now. And if we're not
yeah,
here now, like I end our podcast with, be here now or be nowhere. And that's basically it. But so
yeah,
how do we not be nowhere? We have to get our attention, catch it. Where is it going? What's it looking at? Because there's no choice. We have no free will. We're only going to have stimulus response programs if we can't catch this.
yeah,
So I don't want to be an automaton as much as possible. I want to be able to make a choice. I can't do
yes.
that if I'm not in the present, if I'm not consciously here. Because without the conscious presence, there's no choices possible.
Yes, exactly. And have you had exposure to the Gurdjieff work earlier in your life?
Uh, I'm 60 years into this study. Yeah.
All
I'm
right.
older than I look, but I
Yeah,
started when I was 16. So
I see. Yes. Well, then you know how Gurdjieff created a language for Westerners around mechanicality and being in prison. He took
mm,
all those Eastern concepts and basically translated them into Western lingo that Western intellectuals and artists and anyone could relate to much more easily than the esoteric, Vedic or Buddhist traditions. So in that way, the mechanical thought, the mechanical emotions, the mechanical physical reactions, all of which are conditioned patterns, all of those are like reflections of unconscious life and help to keep us in that prison. So, as we do the inner work, we have to work on, as I said earlier, have to work on multiple levels. So short moments is like the kind of daily praxis, right? And then what are the reminders? Well, life gives us reminders. They're shocks that come in ordinarily from someone stepping on my ego toe, or my injuring my finger, or having an argument with my wife, or whatever it might be. Those are the daily alarm clocks. And then I have to create alarm clocks. I actually have to create reminders. So, for example, what I do, and I still do this occasionally, is I'll get up and I'm left-handed. I'll put my watch on my right hand. I'll put my watch on my left hand. And that reminds me every time I'm aware of it, which at the beginning is a lot because it's awkward, relatively awkward, to wake up in that moment when I experience that awkwardness. Or I generally put my right leg into my right pants leg first. So I'll put my left leg into my left pants leg as a reminder. Or I have an Apple Watch and I'll set it, for example, for every 2 hours to give me an alarm. And I'll do that for a couple of weeks, for example, and that will help create more reminders of moment-to-moment opportunities. But any reminder can become a habit and become itself then a condition, a special condition where one becomes dependent on that. And as you were saying earlier, you have to abandon any system, you have to abandon any tool, but that doesn't mean you don't make use of them. You just want to make use of the right tool at the right time at the right place.
Is it a habit or a pattern, Gunther, that one breaks, or that that seems to be the element for bringing one into the present?
That's
The,
one way. That's
yeah,
one way because as we get age, we develop a what I call and this is a nod to Gurdjieff and Ouspensky. We develop a crystallization process.
yeah,
So, for example, depending on our type and polarity, I'm an intellectual type. Okay, I came in, as Rob introduced, to an intellectual family. So I grew up in a world of the mind, basically. My father was a brilliant teacher, intellectual, and so early on, I was stimulated to study and to learn, and our family conversations were always at a high level of intellect. Uh, However, so that's my type, for example. So people who are oriented around the intellectual type, as we age, unless we are doing something to counter that tendency, our intellectual function tends to deteriorate. We become somewhat fixated, for example, in our beliefs or ideologies or our prejudices or our convictions, for example. So we become more rigid intellectually, and we become less curious and less open to other inputs. Emotionally, it's the same thing for people who are more emotionally oriented. For example, like my wife Ellen, for example, her emotional center is her primary orientation in life. And many artists, for example, have basically that gift, for example, and also that tendency. So as we age, there's a tendency for a crystallization of the emotional center, which is a limited repertoire of emotions. So we feel fear and anger and rage and envy and jealousy and spite and blah blah blah, resentment. So those are the prevailing emotions of the aging community. For example, as a function of the crystallization in which the capacity for feeling as opposed to emotions. I'm making a distinction there between the feeling of joy, the feeling of happiness, the feeling of bliss, the feeling of peace, the feeling of just ease, for example. All those qualities, uh, those tend to become reduced or eliminated. You know? And the similar in the bodily sense, and this is often where, for most people, where it happens, is there's a breakdown of the physical body. So the mobility changes, the habit patterns of gestures, of walking, of movement are very stereotypic, for example. And so if one wants to deal with the crystallization process there, one learns how to do movement practices like Tai Chi. Or in the Gurdjieff work, we had what we call the movements, which was a whole other conversation we could have, which was a very, very powerful set of mind, body, emotional. It was a combination of the mind, the body, and the emotions combined in a set of sacred gymnastics and movements, which required an extremely high level of vigilance and awareness in order to do them properly. So, so for me, the practice of Tai Chi and the continual learning, for example, that I do, because I try to approach Tai Chi with a beginner's mind, like Suzuki Roshi's famous book on beginner's mind. I try to approach my practice of Tai Chi and my learning of it. So one of the things I'm doing here in Hawaii, this is the base for one of the Tai Chi lineages I've studied for about actually more than 40 years. It's going on 60 years now. so, so one of the Yang style lineages based here. And I've had the good fortune of connecting with the living master here and his son, who's actually living in New York now. But more importantly, actually two of the senior disciples of the current master's father, who are in their 70s, who started when they were like in their late 17 or early 20s. And they're very accomplished at a level of working with the master's father. And what you see often in the Tai Chi world is over generations, there is a loss of the knowledge, a loss of the of the skills, for example. Not necessarily obvious to someone who doesn't know, but for someone who has the eyes to see, to practice eyes, which comes about through your own practice, you can see where there's been an involution rather than evolution of the skill set.
What
So
causes that generational deterioration, Gunther?
it's partially the world we live in, the electromagnetic pollution, the quality of nutrition, the capitalist system, the social media
Changing world
now.
around us is what affects it.
That's a major piece of it, yeah.
Yeah.
And also the techniques are lost. Actually, in the Chinese tradition, the kung fu was kept within families because it was connected to up to the introduction of firearms was the main way a family protected their legacy and their lineage from bandits and so on. So hand-to-hand combat and weapons and swords and knives and other martial tools, those were the skills that were learned, and they were kept within the family and within the male lineage of the family. Because if they were taught to the young women and they happened to marry outside the family, that family might be at risk. So over the course of generations, these skills were generally only given fully to the firstborn son. Yeah. Now, if that firstborn son decided, or his karma was not to practice, and many times it was lost because the firstborn would practice for a few years and just that wasn't their karma, and they moved on. That a set of techniques or important internal secret technique that was central to the advanced practices would be lost. So it's multi-causal. There are many factors, but the reality is that that's for the most part what we see. So coming back to my direct experience, I've been able to connect with these two guys who were in their late 60s who started with the grandfather, and one in particular is really knowledgeable, and we become friends. So we've been like sharing things together, sharing our knowledge, and I've gone to a new level in the last year of being here at the age of 89, my Tai Chi has gone to a deeper level.
Wow.
So, and I've been blessed.
Can you connect that, Gunther, to the aging to saging theme that you're actively exploring? Like,
Yes.
how does that fit in?
Yeah.
What is that
It,
all about?
it's directly related to maintaining the physical body as much as possible, right? Through proper nutrition, proper breath, proper exercise, through movements, and particularly for, as we age, through things like being able to maintain mobility and balance, which Tai Chi is really great for, in terms of, just the simplest health and medical applications of it, which is for 99% of practitioners what they want and need and is good for. So the part of when you're talking about aging and saging, what I talked about in that particular podcast that we're talking about here is aging. Staging is conscious aging,
Yeah.
and part of conscious aging then is working simultaneously on the physical, emotional, and mental bodies to create a harmony.
Okay.
And when there is a harmony, there is what's called a triunity, a trinity that arises that becomes the basis for the step-by-step evolution,
Okay.
inner development, if you will.
Okay. I want to come
You
back
know,
for, oh, go ahead, Rick.
I was going to say, no conversation with you, Gunther, would be would be remiss if we did not go back just a little bit to the psychedelic experience.
That's where I was
And
going to go.
oh, okay, yeah, I wanted to make sure that we had it. But rather than suggest anything other than take it away, Meister. You referred to the psychedelic renaissance, and
Mhm.
certainly you were at, let's just say, the birth of that, or way before it might even be considered a renaissance. I think you called it disruptor. And it would be very interesting for all of us to hear path from the initial experimentation.
Mhm.
Does the psychedelic experience have a function or value in today's living to you? And if so, how and what would you say to others? And of course, we'll throw out the word with some caution, or
Yeah.
advice to not do it wantonly or foolishly.
I just want to add one thing to that, Gunther, if you would
Sure.
add
Yeah.
into our audience might be interested, given that you had the grace of working with Ram Dass and Timothy Leary. Ram Dass was an important spiritual teacher for me over the years. Is there any, and I know that you knew him then, and you also visited him in Hawaii on a regular basis over recent decades. Is there any experience you could kind of weave in terms of your experience with Ram Dass that our audience might not know about?
Sure. Well, would you like me to share an experience with Tim first, or go right to Ramdas?
Feel free, follow your path.
Right. Well, let's start with Ramdas since you brought it up. Well, we were, he was my teacher at Harvard in the graduate program. He and Tim. Tim was my faculty advisor. I was assigned to him arbitrarily, so-called arbitrarily by chance or by karma or whatever. The gods were the universe. The Tao was working overtime when he assigned me to Tim.
There are no
So,
coincidences. Yes.
so, so he was, I was assigned to him, and I'll tell the Tim story since I brought it up. So
Cool.
I had my initial meeting with him in his office, which was a redesigned, renovated utility closet on the first floor of the building of the Center for Research and Personality on 5 Divinity Avenue, which was like, an auspicious address, uh, in the
Yeah.
fall of 1960. And I went to find out what the scene was being. And he immediately told me that he had just that summer had taken in Cuernavaca, Mexico, had taken psilocybin with a curandero and had changed his life. And that he was no longer interested in mainstream psychology, but he was interested in the field of consciousness and exploring that through what he considered to be like, the kind of telescope or microscope, the tool of psilocybin being a microscope into one's inner life. He viewed it through a scientific metaphor. If I was interested in joining in that investigation, I would be most welcome. If not, that we would both be best served if I moved on and worked with somebody else. Now, of course, I talked about this in other podcasts, so I won't go into it. But I had experimented, and Rob brought it up earlier. I had experimented with cannabis, in my teens, through the jazz scene, and so I was familiar with, so-called altered states of consciousness, albeit cannabis. But I was curious, and I said, "Well, sign me up." So, 2 weeks later, I had my first psilocybin experience. I also got married in that first 2 weeks. So I had these two life-changing events that happened in the first 2 weeks of, my graduate school. So, and that was the beginning for the next, couple of years of intensive psychedelic experiences done almost on a weekly basis. And, there's a whole set of stories and tales around that. So fast forward, and Ram Dass, many of those sessions were with Ram Dass. Most of them with Ram Dass and Tim and Ralph and George and other people. So the kind of the so-called core group was Timothy, Richard Alpert, aka Ram Dass, Ralph Metzner, George Litwin, and myself. We were the 5 horsemen of the psychedelic apocalypse. And and then there was like a mesoteric circle around that of other graduate students, so friends and relatives, and who were exploring, but not at the level we were, and were sort of maintaining, at least from their own perspective, a need for some independence from what was going to become an impending, political collapse and controversy. And then there's just the external, exoteric circle of society, okay, which at that point, with people like Ken Kesey and a lot of other stuff were LSD and psilocybin was just being explored as a recreational exploration and also spiritual exploration, more or less. So I knew Ram Dass there. So years later, he became Ram Dass and moved to Maui. And Ellen, my wife, and I loved to vacation on Maui. So we went there almost every year for many, many years. I would always seek him out and we'd hang out a little bit. We'd have dinner together and have long talks. But my relationship with him was not one of being a disciple or a student. We were friends that went back to that period at Harvard. And yes, I would say I was still influenced by the quality of his loving presence. It was a wonderful alarm clock. So, whenever I would be in his loving presence, and he was particularly in the latter part of his life after he had the stroke, which actually was a gift to him. He's talked about that in his last book. But he was operating from what I saw and felt and sensed in a 24/7 feeling of loving presence, basically. So he had like a bhakti yoga quality, a devotional yoga combined, which was an element of his emotional center. Because while he was also very intellectual, his primary motivating core was his emotional center. So he had like Brahmanistic qualities as I do. But for example, my core is emotional, physical, actually. I always thought it was intellectual, but it's not. I had a Ayurvedic astrology reading done many years ago, and it revealed to me was that I'm not a Brahmin, I'm a Kshatriya, I'm a warrior, business producer type with Brahmic leanings, right? And emotional leanings. So my my caste was that of a Kshatriya, a warrior. And my spiritual path was that of a bhakti, was devotional. So my connection to the Gurdjieff work was through the heart, and my connection with Ramdas was through the heart. So we would meet and tell stories, and we both enjoyed it. And I think for him especially, uh, when you're in the guru, when you're playing the guru role, you're on a pedestal, and you don't have that many friends. Actually, it can be quite a lonely, role to play, especially as you get older, because people are putting you on a pedestal and doing all kinds of projections on you. And if you're not careful, you start to believe your own PR, which is, one of the occupational hazards of gurudom, which we've seen lots of, which is also characteristic of the times we live in. According to the Indian Vedas, we're living in what's called the Kali Yuga, which is a period of the massive deterioration of society and of all of its functions. And it's said that in the Guru Yoga, that the spiritual teachers arise like maggots on a corpse. That's the that's the imagery of the Gitas. So Ram Dass, that was my connection with him, basically. So one story, for example, is that we have a friend, a body worker, a naturopath in Maui, who, when we would go to Maui, we always get treated by him as well. And he was treating Ram Dass on a weekly basis. He was helping keep him alive. And so this Ralpher and naturopath and healer was an amazing person. Uh, so he knew that Ram Dass and I had this connection. So I hadn't seen him in a lot the first time, going back a bunch of years. I hadn't seen him in many years, and so this friend of mine arranged for me to come to the his clinic in Maui for a session, for my session at the end of Ram Dass's appointment. And he didn't tell Ram Dass what was going on. So as Ram Dass's aides were wheeling him out in his wheelchair, I was sitting in the waiting room, and our eyes met, and I could see kind of his eyes were like a slot machine for a couple of moments, and then the recognition hit, and and we embraced and talked briefly because we had to go home. But within a few days, we were together at his place up in North Maui. Uh, so another Ram Dass story is right after he came back from India from working with his teacher there, uh, and that's a whole story that he describes at length. Uh, I was driving in Harvard Square. I had a little Austin Mini Cooper, the first generation of those, and a little red Cooper, which I love. Really fast, very agile, tight suspension, a lot of fun to drive. So I was at a stoplight in the square, and I looked out through my passenger window, and I saw a white robe, the bottom of a white robe, and a long bead or a mala, a brown chain, which is unusual at that time. You didn't see that, that often. So I got curious. So I couldn't see that person's head. I could only see like the midsection and the mala and the abdominal area because of the height of the Mini Cooper. So I leaned over kind of and looked, gazed out through the window and looked up, and here's Ram Dass standing there waiting on the crosswalk and waiting for the light to turn green. And so I looked at him, he looks at me, I opened the door, he gets in the car, and we drive over to my home in on Mount Auburn Street in Cambridge. And for the next 2 hours, he gives me a download on his whole India experience with
Wow.
Neem Karami Baba and his LSD experience with him and all that. So I got that firsthand, data input from him, which he then, talks about at length and wrote about at length for many years. So that was early on. And then I kind of didn't see him. Well, I saw him again a couple of years later when I was divorced, or a few years later, I was divorced. This was in the early 80s. And I was living in Cohasset on the South Shore of Massachusetts, right near the ocean, right close to the ocean. And I had heard that he was coming to Boston to do a retreat or a talk, and I learned that his father was living in Cohasset. Now, his father was the former head of the New Haven Railroad, and there's that whole story in history
Yeah.
of Ramdas growing up in a wealthy family and having his own airplane and his own Mercedes and all of that. He's talked about that. So his father, and Cohasset was like an upscale community, and he was taking care of his father. He was living there actually for a period of time. I wasn't aware of that. So I wrote him, and or called him. I had his phone number. He called me back, and I was calling at that time. I He came over, and we talked again. We had another talk. Then the third encounter was with my second wife many years later in '93, was dying of cancer. And we were in San Diego and Tijuana, going to Tijuana for treatments for cancer patients who were basically the mainstream had given up on. And I heard he was in town to give a talk. So I reached him. And at that time, and for some years earlier, he was doing a practice of sitting with dying people and helping them. And I shared with him what was going on with Rylan, my wife at the time. And he came over and he ministered to her in our condo or in the apartment we were renting in San Diego at that time. So that was a really wonderful, loving act that he spontaneously changed his schedule, whatever he was doing, to come over to minister to her. So those are some of our Ramdas stories.
And what's wonderful. I was thinking about the psychedelic experience. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you, because even as recently as yesterday, I was meeting with a client, and she's told me that she's going to go off to the Brazilian rainforest for 6 weeks, as she's done almost every year for the last several years. And she was going to engage in ayahuasca ceremonies and, really an attempt to kind of get back to her essence, and to live a very simple, spiritual and exploring life. And I just wanted to ask you, what is your advice to the younger people? Almost everyone is younger than us now, in terms of how they can embrace the goodness that those medicines have, but treat them with the proper respect and the proper need for integrating their use in their lives. I wonder if you can comment on that.
Yeah, I would say there's multiple answers to that question. Okay, the first thing is, which particular psychedelic are we talking about? So, for example, if there's a concern about emotional healing, I think the MDMA experience can be very helpful there. Uh, there are elements of the psilocybin experience which can be utilized in that therapeutic way as well. But also the psychedelic experience has other aspects that relating to the aesthetic experience and the magnification and the deepening of the sensory experience of all the senses. So from an artistic and aesthetic perspective, and also from the sense I would say, of a loosening and a softening of the ego structure, a sense of the relaxing of the crystallized ego, or the stereotypic mind, mental, emotional, physical, especially in mental and emotional components. Psilocybin is a very good tool for that. Uh, if we're talking about, for example, healing of addiction or brain injury, the newest kid on the block is ibogaine, okay, which is actually having some extraordinary results. I've never taken ibogaine. It wasn't part of our repertoire back in the 60s. I knew about it because we had heard about it, because at that time it was actually being used, it had been used for centuries with an African tribe that would use it to help them in their hunt, because it would create a sense of immobility. They could sit for hours in their tent or whatever it is they used, immobile, so that the prey would not detect them, basically. And then, so their breath would slow down, everything would slow down, right? So they used it in that way. Of course, there was, at that time, it wasn't a synthetic. It was combined with the natural alkaloids of other things, so it had probably a different set of effects. So I would say the first answer is, which psychedelic are we talking about? The second thing I would say is set and setting is probably the second most important thing, or the most important thing. So what are your expectations coming into that experience, and what setting is it occurring? If you are expecting just fun and games, okay, but that's probably not the best use of it. But that's okay. It has its place, once or twice. That's probably the limit of that, if that. Uh, if the set is to want to take a deep dive into deepening one's understanding, or the opening up of the emotional, or the decrystallizing of the emotional intellectual center, as I'm describing them here. Well, people wouldn't use those words. Uh, I think the set and setting are really important variables. And of course, the setting would include, or you could call it a separate category, a trained guide, someone that can work with you and carry you through that experience, someone who's deeply experienced in psychedelics themselves and has a therapeutic and spiritual background. Because I think having just a Western therapeutic background is not sufficient. It is a necessary but not sufficient condition. And I think having added to that a therapeutic background with a strong experience in psychedelics and a active spiritual practice, I think for me, would be the ideal criteria for a guide.
And
Have
what
I
about
answered your question?
yeah, you did. I mean, those are really important elements, but what about, like, once you've gone through it, um, what does your wisdom say about the integration after the experience?
I think
Like,
the integration
how does
is
one
critical.
how
Is
does one
critical.
optimize or leverage? Because it's very powerful, can be very powerful experience of transcendence, for example,
Mhm.
and seeing things new,
Yes.
but then there is a need to integrate it, and so a good integration is what's
Uh, a meditation practice,
okay.
because the transcendent experience is an experience. I'm going back to the very beginning of our conversation today. I'm not interested in experiences.
Yeah.
All right. Because experiences, as I said at the beginning, have a beginning, a middle, and end. And then you're on to the next experience. So there's a pattern in the so-called psychedelic renaissance now of people going repeatedly to ayahuasca ceremonies, or taking, psilocybin or LSD or DMT, or whatever the new, the new bon ton drug psychedelic of the week is. And that, I think, creates a sense of addiction, not physically addicting, but it's an addiction to being in a certain condition. So the epitome of that, for example, is the Wall Street guys and gals who are going to the local ketamine clinic at lunch hour for a ketamine infusion
Right.
before they're back on the trading floor, right? So that, or if you saw, the Billionaire, that TV series, right? Or what was it called? You know,
Maybe it is
anyway,
called Billionaires. Yeah.
yeah, which were, basically featured in the later episodes of the later years, a number of psychedelic ayahuasca
Yeah.
type retreats and things.
Uh-huh.
So it was basically used to create a relief. It was used as a medication or an escape. And what Gurdjieff pointed out to Ouspensky, Ouspensky's biography of Gurdjieff, called "In Search of the Miraculous," uh, when he talked about psychedelics, or he talked about certain substances. And by the way, when Tim and Ralph and I and George, we were exploring the kind of history of psychedelics and an indigenous use of them, because all of our experiences brought us to a deep interest in exploring the history of this. We came across Ouspensky's book and read it, and then fixated on that particular piece of it, and we're convinced that Gurdjieff was talking about psychedelics, which led Ralph to go to a meeting in New York City of Willem Nyland, my teacher in the Gurdjieff work, who then passed it on to me, and that's how I connected with Nyland. But in that book, Gurdjieff is quoted by Ouspensky as saying that these substances have under the paraphrase, they have their place in opening up the possibility of giving someone an idea of what may be possible for them in terms of their inner life and their inner freedom, their spiritual freedom, their enlightenment, okay, whatever you want to call it, their Buddha nature, their, whatever it is. However, the repeated use of them, the dependency on them, leads to madness and death. So he cautioned people against repeated experiences. I view, the language I'm using to describe it to people today in the context of the question you're asking me here is, I view it as a simulator. Okay. Like a fighter pilot gets into a simulator, which, if it's a good simulator, it has all the tools of gravitational pull, of
Yeah.
stress, of pressure, of gauges, of visual overloads, and you're learning how to fly at Mach 1 or 2 in an F-15 or F-16 through the simulator. So I view the psychedelics as simulators of pointing to the real thing. And
Okay.
the real thing comes through the inner work.
Right.
So
Right.
waking up can happen with or without psychedelics.
Of
I
course.
mean, one of my teachers years ago just said, he was telling a story about a monk, Japanese monk, who spent 20 years in an ashram, couldn't get anywhere, finally climbed the wall in the middle of the night and escaped from the ashram, ended up in a local bar having a couple of drinks, and fell off the bar stool and got enlightened. So, so it can happen any number of ways, and
Right.
psychedelics are a very good vehicle for giving you the experience of rigpa or samadhi, of
Yeah.
freedom, but it's momentary. So the
Yeah.
conditioned patterns will come back, and then so people then will become dependent, and they'll have to go back to the jungle or
Mhm.
back. And it's not dissimilar to what I was describing earlier about becoming dependent on a set of conditions,
Right.
which in a relative sphere, there's no end to the beginning and end of relative conditions, and the dependency on them can become an addiction.
Yeah.
Even sitting on the meditation cushion can become an addiction,
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
because it's positing a means ends connection,
Right.
like a goal and a means. So what we're talking about here in terms of the inner life is not about achieving a goal.
Yeah.
It's the process. It's the moment to moment process. Okay.
Yeah, that makes sense. I have one more question, but before I ask it, I want to defer to Thomas to see if you have any comment or question for Gunther that
I have a
it's a
thought, Gunther. When you first came on the screen, I thought, oh, hey, there is a solar Saturn, probably emotionally centered, maybe even the King of Hearts. And I thought, oh, yeah, but you also studied this system. So I wondered if you were typing me.
No,
No.
I don't use the Enneagram that way.
Well, the reason I was asking is because it
Hmm.
comes back to what you were saying earlier about alarm clocks, waking up.
Hmm.
One of the
Yeah.
things that's happened over the years for me is that if I notice type or alchemy or anything else,
Hmm.
I use these as wake up calls. So as soon as I'm seeing you and my programming starts analyzing you, I think, well, where are you, Thomas? Are you here or not? I mean, I can be sitting here like Ospinski said, and this is part of what you were saying earlier. He says you can find money on the street, but you can't live on it. So
Yeah.
all of our programming to be in the present is irrelevant if we're not actually being in the present. So
Right.
what do we have to do that? We have to just keep coming back over
Mom,
and over again. And every
short, short
yeah,
moments.
yeah. So part of what we've talked about on Three Voices frequently is what is the day-to-day activity that is enlightened living? I think you answered that with your comment about how frequently we have to refresh being in the present because the moment's going, we don't know how fast the moment's going by. We just
Yeah.
know it's not the past or the future, but it's
Yeah.
pretty fast, probably.
Yeah.
So that means we have
And
to be coming back really frequently.
yeah, and it's any activity.
Any
In
activity.
any
Yeah.
and all activities. So there
Oh,
are no activities that are characteristic or
uh,
features of a so-called enlightened life. If there's
yeah.
any feature, it's the ability or the quality or the embodiment, okay, beyond the effort
Uh,
uh, of. So my teacher, Mr. Nyland, in the Gurdjieff work, I'll end with this from my perspective. Uh, he described this process in mathematical analogies. So you have a horizontal line of ordinary consciousness, the mechanical, robotic, ordinary, day-to-day, dreaming, waking state. Okay, the waking state of being in a waking dream. Okay, the mechanical, robotic consciousness. Then you're introduced to something like the Gurdjieff work or spiritual practice, and you have moments of awakening, which are a horizontal point above the horizontal line. Now, mathematically, a line is composed of an infinite number of points. So we create the line of awareness, presence, through repeated moments of short moments, which eventually creates a stimulation or an approximation of a line of consciousness that parallels the ordinary analytic mind, what Gurdjieff called the form, formulatory apparatus, okay, the formatory apparatus, okay, the stenographer's function. So this line of consciousness is created mathematically by infinite repeated moments of awareness, which over time one has the experience of living closer to that edge or on that edge or in that space spontaneously,
yes.
which doesn't eliminate the need to create alarm clocks or to work with special conditions that you create intentionally in order to test your muscle strength. And in the Gurdjieff work, that was called experimentation. So the first phase was observation, which includes the self-observation of gathering the data on the personality, of the type and the habits and all the kinds of sins of commission and omission, all the all the stuff, right? Ordinary stuff. Then and then introducing in that context the capacity for self-remembering, and then the phase of participation, which is bringing the work into ordinary life, like the day-to-day activities, and using things like the body, the gait, the tone of voice, the awareness of if one can do this, of inner functions like the heartbeat and blood circulation, of language, of normal habits like eating and speaking and so on, which are just ordinary activities, which you then use to help you integrate the awareness or integrate ordinary life into, or both integrating. Then there is the stage of what's called experimentation, where you create special conditions which are difficult, which are based on intentional suffering, what Gurdjieff called intentional suffering, which is creating discomfort intentionally, creating circumstances where you don't feel happy or uncomfortable or comfortable, in order to see, can I bring this awareness into this area? Not with the idea of feeling better, because that's a means ending. Then you fall into the emotional bypass syndrome, but purely in order to test can I live this truth when these circumstances are difficult? Okay. So my experimentation at the moment is dealing with life in the USA today under Trump. What's going on in Israel? Those are, for me as a Jew, who had been a Zionist for years and has spent time in Israel and loves the country and loves what people have done there in that country, the extraordinary developments over years. As someone said recently, Jews have had bad press PR for 3,000 years, but we're no longer losing the wars. So anyway, at the same time, the circumstances of what's going on in Israel, how the Palestinian people are being treated, what's happening in Gaza, the Likud administration of Netanyahu and his right-wing crazies, that is very disturbing to me. And the growth of anti-Semitism, which for many people, both in the so-called progressive left and the right, are using Gaza and Palestinian as a way of deepening intentionally anti-Semitism, because their agenda is primarily around anti-Semitism rather than the healing. So that's what I'm dealing with right now. Okay. I'm trying to kind of figure out, where do I land in this space? Rob and I talked about that yesterday in our session. So
one of the thoughts, Gunther, that comes to me very often is what I refer to as identity attachment, because Buddha talked about non-attachment, but it's the identity attachment that's the primary problem that we have when we get involved. And like you were saying earlier too, that even in a practice where we're having some success, being more conscious in the moment we're in, it can become an identity. And as soon as it does, and we attach to that, then it will start repeating automatically, and there will be no consciousness in the moment
yes.
to do it.
Yes.
So in relation to politics for myself, I use the news of politics and things happening in the world to help wake me up, but I remain a kind of political atheist, because I've met politicians in too many countries now, and too self-serving throughout. I mean, they do not represent the public well-being as the concept of democracy and politics involves. So what do?
That's true.
Profit, right? So the main
That's true.
people like us, or anyone that has any concept of present consciousness, when these things come up, to derive less identity from them and more consciousness from them is what
thank you for that. It's using those circumstances basically in the way I described. I have a harder time with it because of my Holocaust background and the traumas that my family and I went through. I spent a lot of early years in therapy and also in psychedelic
Mm,
self-psychedelic therapy, working to unwind those. My
mm,
father was arrested on Kristallnacht. The Nazis came to our home and took him to Buchenwald. I was hid in the attic. I was 1 year old. I was hid in the attic by a Christian nurse
mm,
that my parents had hired that was working with us. And so when I was in my mom's wound, I went through that whole, it wasn't just a few years, it was like 10 years or longer leading up to Kristallnacht and then beyond. My dad got out of Buchenwald because he had French papers. He was born in Alsace-Lorraine between the First and Second World War. And my mother went into Gestapo headquarters in Frankfurt, presented his French papers, and demanded his release because Germany was not yet at war with France. And
mm,
the German bureaucratic mind, which which was manifest in Nazi Germany in the industrial grade extermination, released my father from
mm.
Buchenwald, pushed him out of the gates. He hitchhiked and to a nearby village overnight, borrowed some money from a Jew living in that village, got on a train, went back to Frankfurt after 2 or more weeks in Buchenwald. My mother barely recognized him. He told me
Mm,
that 10% of the population were being executed on a nightly basis. Mm.
mm.
And we left Germany less than a month later. So that's the history. Okay.
Yeah,
So
yeah, difficult.
I've worked with that. I'm not triggered like I used to be, but there are still some triggers, and I just got to honor that. Okay.
Yeah, I agreed. Absolutely agreed. We can't not be what we are and who we
Yeah.
are. We are a being. We
Yeah.
would just want to be a more conscious being. It doesn't
Yeah.
change those
Exactly.
other things or stop them from being there, but it
Right.
does change our level of awareness of them and the utility they provide.
We have personalities. We have
Yeah.
conditioned patterns.
Yeah.
One of the teachings that I loved is Ramada, Ramada and Nisargadatta. I'm thinking of Nisargadatta Maharaj, one of the
Mm.
great Vedic sages, lived in an apartment in Bombay in
Ah.
the prostitute in the red light district. Held his satsangs in his attic. He had to crawl up a ladder to get to his crowded hot attic, and people would crowd in there, maybe 30, 40 people, sweating their ass off, and he would in his own irascible kind of way would lecture them on waking up, and it would smoke beaties and sit
Okay.
on a tiger skin.
Mm.
And the people that came out of the more traditional kind of Vedic traditions around purification and sanctification would say, well, how can you be enlightened? He smokes cigarettes and sits on a tiger skin. And one day he responded and he said there are a few habits. I
I
leave
love
them alone.
love
I leave
Bombay.
them alone.
Yeah, I mean, one way I'm relating to what's just being said, like there are these experiences like the Holocaust experience and different aspects of it. For me, it was the uh, being informed of my father's experience as a pilot in World War II and being in a German prison camp after being shot down. So there's these experiences of the Jews, the Palestinians, which I think it's important to really um, grok those experiences. Like they have a certain texture to them, at a certain depth. And I think humanity is coming to grips is like one has to dig into those experiences. And then there's the political points of view. And to me, those are polarities. There's almost nothing. I mean, there's a reason why people have this point of view and that point of view, but they to me, I see them. I try to find that fulcrum in the middle because there's polarities between them, and there's a place in the mind, in Taoism and other, they call it the higher mind, where one rises above the thises and the that's of a given political point of view to find out, to understand the depth of the polarity and the paradox among those points of view.
Yes,
And I think all those things are necessary to really come to grips with these issues.
I would agree with that. And then trying to understand what that so-called lens is. So, for example, when Gurdjieff was leading 75 of his students, disciples out of Russia, uh, this is written about in his second book, and other people have referred to it. He was he, they this was at the at the very beginning of the Bolshevik Revolution, and so the Tsar's army and the Bolsheviks were fighting, were in war, and all over the country. And Gurdjieff was leading his people out of Russia, and so he had them wear apparel that mimicked whether they were both either or Tsarists or Red Russians. Uh, they were they were disguised as an archaeological expedition,
Right.
and he would see on the this was a story he would see on the horizon dust clouds which indicated like horses, a battalion or a group of militias. And he could tell psychically or whatever his gift was, whether they were Tsarists or Bolsheviks. And then he would alert his people as to what to put on and how to speak when those people came. And they were generally left alone. Because they were seen as scientists who were not political, basically. So
Right.
he led them out that way.
Yeah.
He functioned in Nazi Germany, in Nazi occupied Paris, teaching groups of his students at night during curfews
Yeah.
with the shades drawn in the middle of the Nazi occupation,
Interesting.
and dealing with Nazis on a daily basis in the black market, uh, supporting old people in his apartment building and neighbors with food and medicines as a bodhisattva would or could, and still teaching a few of his students that were able to take the risk of going to his apartment for those teachings. There's a book
Yeah.
about that called The Rope, which is a group of women students who were taught during wartime. Amazing book.
It's called The
Yeah.
Rope.
The Rope, yeah.
Yeah. I want that. I want to embody that story.
And what Gurdjieff said was quoted as saying, and this is part of what I'm working with also, when we talked about the administration and Palestinians and Israelis, Gurdjieff said that was quoted as saying is during difficult times, the times we're living in, where, which he described as due to certain cosmic forces arising, certain planetary influences, called it sulionensis, was his phrase, where cosmic patterns were happening and they would amplify and magnify in the solar system and create even more imbalances among people who were neurotic or psychotic or emotionally imbalanced, and would create increased incidences of war and torture and oppression. It said it's during these times that there's the greatest opportunity to wake up and work with those negative influences, because there's so much more energy available.
Hmm.
So if you can learn how to, in a tantric sense, how to convert that energy, in tantric Buddhism, it's about converting energies, converting poisons.
Right.
So turning anger into energy, turning fear into compassion, whatever those alchemical conversions are. That's the path of Tantra. So Gurdjieff operated with that, but that is at the level of what I described of the experimentation.
Right, right. I
Yeah.
like that.
You really
So,
have to have you really have to have a, I would say, a relatively deep-seated capacity for presence awareness.
yeah.
It's not for beginners.
So Gunther, we're almost out of time here. We have a few more minutes. Um, I just want to ask you any pearls of wisdom to share for Rick and I and Thomas as we endeavor to travel ski down the mountain toward enlightened living. Anything you might want to
Yeah,
impart
I
to us?
would just say short moments, my friends.
It sounds very good. I think we
Perfect.
should leave that as something to ponder. And I,
Or, as Gurdjieff said, remember yourself always and everywhere.
right. I try to do that. I remember you told me that. And I do rub my two fingers together as a reminder.
Yep.
So this has been
Remember Zorba?
wonderful, Gunther. Thomas, you want to say something?
I was going to say, remember Zorba the Greek when he used to click his fingers?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the Greek beads, the prayer beads are actually, that's their purpose. In the original Coptic and Greek Orthodox and Catholic, real Catholic traditions, the so-called worry beads were the reminding factors.
Yeah, be here now or be nowhere.
Very good. Okay. Well, thank you again, Gunther. This has been a real joy
Yeah.
and pleasure. And
Now, may
we'll
I ask, Rob, Gunther, would you mind another session at another time? We
No,
would love to.
I would love to do that. I'm enjoying these. I'm actually working with Rob now on his project, integrating my values work. But I realized yesterday, and I had a sleepless night last night, very creative, thinking of all the possible scenarios of using AI. But one of the things that came up was I'm using these many different interviews, transcribing them, and then using them to write my memoirs.
Oh, nice.
Because I don't have the Sitzfleisch, as we say in German, or the patience to sit down, even with a great editor, and write them from, but I'm great at interviewing and transcribing and then editing that. So I already can see the outlines of my memoirs around Paris, the jazz scene, psychedelics, spiritual. I can see the chapters. So
That sounds good. I look forward to supporting you in that. Um,
Likewise.
all right,
all right,
good.
gentlemen, have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you
Yeah.
out there.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you.